what was on the Chinese spy balloon. It can maneuver to whatever position it wants. First in Alaska, came down through Canada, and then came into the United States, one of our three large ICBM, intercontinental ballistic missile bases, only B-2 bomber base that we have here in the country. Clever countries also send in sleeper agents.
It's a really sleeper.
Agents came in to the Supermicro plant, inserted a few hundred of these grain of rice chips, monitored by U.S. military. Did we allow trapdoors in critical servers to be enabled? Even though we shot down the balloon, it had already done its work.
Launch a war against America.
And we do it too, but we don't like it when it's done to us.
Hello, Moshang viewers. Welcome back. Today, Mr. Heifer is going to present what is the CCP balloon trying to spy.
Good afternoon, Dr. Liu. The topic today is what was on the Chinese spy balloon. So I presume everybody here knows what the Chinese spy balloon was. This is a picture of it that was taken by someone on the ground with a powerful telescope. So it's a great big balloon with a bunch of solar panels and some electronic equipment underneath it. What might it be doing? Well, let's go back in time. So in World War II, the United States and other countries outfitted a bunch of aircraft with special electronic receiver gear. Their job was to go out and scout ahead over sites that might be bombed to see what radar signals and what communication signals they could pick up. So these were called ferret aircraft, and they picked up the radio signals and radar signals so that they could later tell the bombing crews which signals to jam and what to avoid. So that's kind of what this balloon was likely doing. Now, could it have been just a weather balloon? Not really very likely. This is a weather balloon here, and to scale, this is the Chinese balloon. So there's a number of differences. First of all, it's much bigger, but it has this large array of solar panels to provide a lot of power. And then if you look closely here, there's a high gain radio antenna that can direct a lot of power down to selected points on the ground. Why not just use a satellite if you want to spy on someone? Well, the balloon does have some advantages. First of all, it's much closer to the ground, 20 kilometers versus hundreds of kilometers. It's below the ionosphere, which satellites are above, and the ionosphere can interfere with radio signals. It also spends a much longer time over any given spot on the Earth, and within some limitations, it can maneuver to whatever position it wants to observe. What did it observe? Well, here is the path of the balloon. It entered first in Alaska, came down through Canada, and then came into the United States right about here at the corner of Washington. And then it passed right over Malmstrom Air Force Base, which just happens to be one of our three large ICBM, intercontinental ballistic missile bases. And then it proceeded on, and by some coincidence, it went over Whiteman Air Force Base, which is the only B-2 bomber base that we have here in the country. So what might it have been looking for? Well, just like the ferret aircraft, it was probably looking for air defense radar signals. It could also easily get stray emissions from cell phones, Wi-Fi, printers, things like that. But what else might it do? Are there other things that it might be able to accomplish? So let's talk a little bit about how spy operations are conducted. When a country sets out to spy on another country, they try to send in agents, and the agents collect information and send it back. But the problem is that very often the process of collection and sending back winds up getting the spies discovered. And so they're only useful for a certain period of time, and then they have to either leave the country or go to jail or something. So clever countries also send in sleeper agents. What is a sleeper agent? Well, it's a type of spy, but it doesn't do anything. It just blends in and remains inactive and inconspicuous for most of the time. And then when a crisis is imminent, it's activated. And here's an article from the Daily Mail from just a few years ago about China sending sleeper agents into the United Kingdom on Hong Kong visas. And of course, down here is one of the famous sleeper agents for a couple of uses of the term sleeper.
And she's a really sleeper.
But today, a lot of spying is not just done by people going in and collecting secret documents from army bases and things like that. A lot of it, probably most of it, is done over the internet, involving hacking into servers and databases. But the same thing happens. Unauthorized data transfers generally, after a while, wind up getting caught, and then that source is no longer useful. So the question is, could there be an electronic form of a sleeper agent? Well, maybe. In 2018, Bloomberg reported on what they called a grain of rice microchips, which they claimed were secretly inserted on larger chips made by a company called Supermicro in China. Now, that story was denied by the affected companies, Supermicro and the users of their products, but Bloomberg stood by the story. And subsequently, Supermicro pulled out of China, as did the firms that were making the things for the other companies. So is it possible that both are right, that Amazon and Supermicro and so forth couldn't find any of these microchips, but they really were there? And to me, a simple answer is that agents came into the Supermicro plant, inserted a few hundred of these grain of rice chips onto servers, but that's out of millions of them. So they'd be very hard to see when they're on a chip. And if they're not doing anything, they're very hard to detect. So the question is, could these be sleeper chips to provide a secret backdoor into the servers of the affected systems that would only be activated later on when the spy agency wanted the information? So how could you activate them? Well, one possibility would be that you could use radio signals. But the problem is that the signal has to be able to get down to Earth, get inside whatever building they're in, and get inside the computer case. And the chip itself can only have an antenna that's a few millimeters on a side. So what frequencies could you use for this that might possibly work? Well, it turns out that 100 gigahertz wavelength is about 3 millimeters. And that is small enough to fit through this grill work on computer fans and things like that, ductwork going into buildings and so on. And it has another advantage, that these frequencies are not routinely monitored by U.S. military SIGINT sources. So just as an illustration, down here, this is a 1 foot ruler, and 1 gigahertz, very conveniently, has a wavelength of about a foot. So that won't fit through this grill work. Your Wi-Fi system and your microwave oven have a frequency of about 2.5 gigahertz. So this wave, the wavelength being from there to there, about 5 inches, that won't go through. But 100 gigahertz wave looks like this. And now the wavelength is only 3 millimeters. So that and higher frequencies could get through this wire mesh. So why doesn't the military look there? Well, because it's a new band. We haven't had any equipment that operated in that band for a long, long time. Here's just a chart of some military spectrum usage. And you see that the vast majority of military systems are down here between 300 megahertz and roughly a gigahertz. And then there are some things that go up to about 3 gigahertz, such as maritime, mobile satellite, radio navigation, meteorological aids, such as are on weather balloons. But we're talking about frequencies that are way up here on this end of the spectrum. So 100 gigahertz, one would be roughly here. And so that's mostly just the province of radio astronomy. So the military really doesn't look there. So they might not know if the satellite were broadcasting signals in that area. So the question is, could the balloon transmit enough power to activate these chips down on the ground? Well, I'm not going to go through all of the math here, but for your reference, this is what's called the Friis equation that says how much power is received, that's PR, for a given amount of power transmitted, and as a function of the gain of the antennas and the wavelength and the range. So if you do that math, you can transmit from a balloon that's 65,000 feet high, you can get a signal that's roughly 1.5 microwatts, way more than you need for a cell phone type system to pick it up. But you also have to get through the atmosphere. And so here's a plot of atmospheric losses per kilometer at 100 gigahertz. And that's really not too bad. That's about another factor of 10. And now the really tricky part that's basically impossible to compute. Somehow that signal has to also get through the building and into the computer. So I put another factor of 100 loss on there, which results in a perceived power of about 1.5 picowatts. That's above the minimum detectable signal level, so it is possible that this signal could get through. And because the balloons loiter over the target for a long time, they can send this signal thousands of times, and it only has to get through once. So the question is, why can't we get answers about this out of our government? So first of all, are they sleeper microchips? Do they exist in some small percentage of the systems that might be in use at Malmstrom Air Force Base or at the B-2 base? Could the balloon successfully transmit to the grain of rice microchips? They would know whether it could by looking at the electronic instrumentation on board the balloon, but they haven't told us anything about it. And that leads to the question, by waiting for the balloon to cross the entire United States, did we allow trapdoors in critical servers to be enabled? Even though we shot down the balloon, it had already done its work. And the question to me is, does the government even know the answers? And when are they going to tell us something? So that concludes my speculation on the payload of the Chinese spy balloon. So if you have any questions.
This is very cool, but already terrifying to know this kind of information. I know because a lot of information are disclosed by the government. We basically based on our suspicions and speculation. But I think there's some reasonable logic behind your analysis. So it looks like a terrible. I fear we are under the massive spying of the Chinese government.
I agree. And mostly, I just want to know, what does the government know about the payload on the balloon? Because they have said basically nothing. And I don't understand why they're doing that. It simply encourages speculation like mine and even crazier things.
Yeah, I think this government is not very transparent in many things. One possibility, they just wanted to don't cause some unfavorable thinking about their leadership. Another thing could be they just complete, like you said, don't know what's going on. They ignore those kind of possibilities. So I think maybe you can give them your paper to let them seek those kind of possibility.
Well, I did send this paper out to a fellow who has done a lot of electronic warfare analysis. He agrees that the ferret portion of the mission is probably what was on the balloon. He didn't particularly want to comment on the activation, I should say, of the parasite chips, because the truth is we don't know that they exist. But Bloomberg has published two different stories, the original story and a backup story when the existence of the chips was denied. And so I can't imagine that they would just make that up. They must have some evidence. And then the question is, well, what do those chips do?
If those chips really exist, it's kind of like China launch a war against America.
The internet is already a war zone. It's not just the Chinese, but it certainly includes them. And you know well that they use both open and covert means to channel information, to capture information, and we do it too, but we don't like it when it's done to us.
Thank you for the very interesting presentation. We look back to talk to you again next time. Bye-bye.